Now, COP27, which is happening at Egypt, uh, unusually and quite necessarily, is now seized of the problem of finance. Until last COP26, it was there, but I think now the push and the urgency, and then the concern has become very serious in COP27, just because of loss and damage. Now, loss and damage again was part of COP meetings earlier, and especially after COP 15 Paris Agreement. But this year, African nations and of course Pakistan, they forced the countries to accept loss and damage as one of the agenda items in COP27. And that's how I think the focus is more on finance, climate finance. And as it was mentioned, climate finance commitments are completely off track, and they are very low from what has been promised in Paris agreement. So they said $100 billion, but I think hardly 20% of that money has been transferred, and that actually goes mostly to mitigation or adaptation. So loss and damage finance has never been discussed. So this COP, that is where they are trying to, bring that finance as well. And of course, last I think yesterday and probably today and even last week, there was separate meeting on quantifying the goal of our climate finance. So now these discussions are still at a preliminary stage. So they are not yet quantified, but there are various estimates. One is, some are running into billions and some are into $1 trillion. I think one estimate says every year $1 trillion are needed up to 2050. So that means almost $28 trillion are required for cutting emissions, adaptation, and loss and damage. So that's one estimate. So there are different estimates. So yesterday, our Minister for Environment, Bhupender Yadav, when he was releasing this strategy, long-term strategy, and also he was in a ministerial meeting. Yesterday there was a ministerial meeting. There he referred one to the definition of climate finance. Even though it was apparent what is climate finance, but when it is coming into negotiations and when it is related with the three activities, not just cutting emissions and adaptation. Now it is about loss and damage as well. So now I think the demand has come from India and also IMF. Christiana Lagarde on I think somewhere on 8th or 9th November, she raised this that we need a definition for climate finance. So this definition looks, somewhere a political game to stall any, progress in committing climate finance. It looks like that because if you look at the COP history, in fact, much before COP, in Rio Earth Summit in 1992, it was agreed that emissions have to be reduced and whatever costs are coming up, that has to be financed by these industrialized countries. So this was always there, agreed upon long back. And in fact, the target of committing emissions was 2000. So 22 years back, that was there. So if that was not done, and now if we are again talking of definition, I think somewhere this looks more like a political ploy rather than a honest approach to solve the problem. And second issue is, you know, where where it has to go. I think, more than where, people are talking about mechanisms. Now, climate finance, we already have, as Sahu has mentioned, Green Climate Fund is there, Global Environment Facility is there, and now there is a Global Fund for Adaptation as part of COP, under UNFCCC. But now, developing countries are asking for a separate finance facility for loss and damage, which appears very reasonable because when you look at the demand coming from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and then the loss and damage which is immediately being faced by small island nations, which are very small in terms of size, all dimensions. So I think these countries are saying they require immediately this loss and damage finance because they are facing the consequences of global warming in terms of rise in sea level, and of course floods, drought, even all those damages are there. So they don't want to enter into this quagmire, which some of the challenges were mentioned by both the speakers about time consumption, inflexible approach, and basically mechanism, validity, integrity. I think all those issues have been bogging access to climate finance. So I think this demand for a separate facility is basically trying to avoid that. In fact, I know the reports have been submitted for a global environment facility eighth round in this COP27, and also global goal on adaptation, even adaptation fund board reports. So all these reports of the existing funds and the mechanisms indicate that it's not easy. So in that scenario, I think these countries are asking for separate facility for loss and damage, which developed countries are not ready to accept. They think this is not the time to discuss that. So the third issue is, in fact, that's why I asked the question, moral hazard, what Sahu was mentioning. But I think I explained it, so it is something different from. There is another moral hazard which I want to, which not me, but UN Secretary General raised in his COP27, summit meeting. He raised that this is a moral principle because all the polluting countries who are historically responsible for emissions, they are liable to pay for the damages caused by the pollution. So the polluter pays principle has been very forcefully brought out by the UN Secretary General himself. And he said this is a moral obligation. It puts a moral obligation. So he was not referring to any, even though the principle is there, it has been accepted legally in several countries long back. So, but this is an international, mechanism. So he was referring to it as a moral obligation. But then last year itself, EU has, negated this. They said there's no moral obligation because currently EU, every citizen is going through a cost of living crisis. They are facing energy costs. So he meant to say they themselves are facing the problems. So, but even though they have not accepted it, and the US has also not accepted loss and damage. In fact, they blocked any movement on loss and damage finance last COP26. But this time they allowed discussions to happen. But I don't think something will emerge, though there's a lot of expectation that COP27 will come up with something on loss and damage finance, and the small island nations have high hopes on something will emerge out of it. So EU and US are rejecting the moral obligation. They are rejecting the obligation because they have done pollution, and because of that pollution, somebody else is facing the problem. So this has not been accepted, and because of that, I wonder whether loss and damage, or even in general finance, climate finance, will become a there will be a fruitful path for increasing or getting the committed funds. Now, within that, within this broader framework of understanding, there are several issues which are coming up. One is, within the this three broad verticals of cutting emissions, adaptation, and loss and damage, which are the sectors which will be concentrated, especially because when you're talking of mitigation, which is the sector where these funds are being targeted. And that usually are only two sectors right now. What we have seen is in energy sector where funds are available for shifting from conventional to renewable energies. And that's how we have seen now NABARD is also a part of giving funds for solar energy projects. Uh, and second is industries, because they came in through this net zero commitment, and net zero and the clean development mechanism. Clean development mechanism is prior to net zero concept. So CDM, carbon credits, net zero, carbon capture, I think all of this together are lampooned, and this some of the streams of climate finance. So that again goes mostly to the companies or businesses which are again historically polluting or contributors of carbon emissions. But and of course, the third one is the transport. So where we are seeing most investments are going to electrical vehicles, but not to the approaches. It's only about technology again. The most of the finance here you can see it is tied with the technology or tied with some investment rather than approach or a change in approach or any transformation. And then there is completely very low funding for finance for agriculture. Even though agriculture is seen as one of the big contributors of carbon emissions, especially in this modern agriculture where chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and even a lot of mechanized tools are used. So this still is not getting funds. Is one of the issues which has been flagged frequently, but Of course, as I mentioned, this climate finance negotiations have not gone into that area, but so it is becoming a process of the within the current financial structures. Whatever they think, whatever they accept, that is getting some traction. So there, I think on again on 8th November, there was this call for reforms of World Bank and uh, International Monetary Fund and all these multilateral institutions. In fact, World Bank President David Malpass, he is titled as a climate denier. So that means he's yet to accept that climate change and the disasters which are consequentially coming up. So, but apart from him, the IMF chief herself has said we need a reform of these multilateral institutions. So, World Bank, IMF, all these multilateral financial institutions, they need to be reformed so that the climate finance flows out of these financial institutions. So that call was given, but I think maybe there is a need for a separate stream of negotiations to enable that or facilitate that process, and also acceptability of that from US and other G7 countries. So I think that's very, very critical. But there is a mild tension which is building. Just because climate finance is not coming, it is still underlying. But the mild tension right now we can see is between the private finance and public finance. So most of the developing countries, they are looking for public finance rather than private finance. But then developed countries, they are keen on developing channels or mechanisms which enable flows from the private companies and private finances. So this again somewhere is related to the current economic structure and the reluctance of the dominant players in the current economic structure to forego their financial dominance. I think that I see clearly. And that's where somewhere the ideological discussion is coming about capitalism, whether we need to overthrow capitalism and even state capitalism from China. So these kind of discussions are again, are taking off from that. Not going into that, I think there is a major demand for debt cancellation. So the simplest thing now, some countries have brought forward is they said, okay, climate finance definition, mechanism, funding, timing, all these inflexible approaches, scrutiny. So all this is one aspect which I think it will take its own pace. But now, right now, many of the countries are in debt. So they said, why can't this debt be cancelled? So debt waiver can be. I think that will help to for countries to begin afresh. So Mauritius President Mohammad Naushad, he put this forward. He said, whatever funds we have right now, national budget, so most of it is going to debt servicing or civil servant salaries, and maybe 10-15% is going to here and there. So he says debt cancellation will achieve much more at a single stroke. That's what his view is. I think there are others who support that kind of approach. So debt cancellation and consolidation is one of the approaches which is being suggested for climate finance. Then the problems, as I mentioned, just like between private finance and public finance. Now there are two different committees which are working on implementing Paris Agreement. One is a committee which is looking at market approaches to carbon reductions, and that is where the finance is being discussed. And there is another body which is looking at non-market approaches. So most of the market approaches, as I mentioned, were about clean development mechanism, carbon credits, or carbon capture technologies, transfer of technology. So all this is related to that, and that is seen as a part of a market approaches. And then the second is non-market approaches, where most of the African countries are putting their hopes on. And this is still at a rudimentary process. What kind of non-market approaches are there? So informal talks are going on. I think some text is there, but maybe by the end of this week, some draft text will emerge, and maybe a cover decision will be taken or recommended. Now, I think somewhere Sahu has mentioned this about the metrics. How do you measure what and where? I think this is again an international issue because who measures what, and what comes under climate finance as a damage, or what is a climate related disaster? How do we measure that? So these metrics measurements, I think, is again issue which has not been resolved so far, and since where the all these negotiations are at a beginning level, so metrics, I think, will come once a framework of consensus emerges on this climate finance. But I think it is still going to be a uphill task when it comes to metrics and mechanisms, because it works both ways. As long as there is trust, and if the trust is not there and mistrust comes in, I think you need to have all these mechanisms. So trust has been flagged by several speakers, in this COP27 and even before as well, including Indian Environment Minister. So they are talking of how to build the trust. So trust building as a one way of looking at metrics is also being called for. Now, there are these funds, Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facility and Adaptation Fund. Now, the whatever finance is coming through them is very low and very bureaucratic, or in fact, it is not accessible by many. So, in that sense, I think people hopes on loss and damage is very low. So now that's where some suggestions are coming on how to generate national level funding for climate finance. Apart from the the flows which are expected from polluters to the victims, or developed countries to the developing countries, or from the multilateral institutions to the developing countries or least developed countries. I think this is another method which is being suggested. So there, one of the suggestions is for a carbon tax, and that carbon tax should be imposed across the globe, and that has to operate at the national level. So that is one method. And two, now recently in this year, this COP27, many scientists have now taken up a visible action, trying to highlight the private jet travelers and the money they have. These are all billionaires. They are traveling on a private jet, and they are contributing to the global emissions. So They said, why can't we tax private jets? So there's taxing the polluters, taxing the billionaires, or taxing the wealth concentrated wealth concentration. I think that is one method which is being suggested. But given that United Nations as a international body is still a voluntary body, there's no legal mechanism at an international level where this can happen. So it means it has to be at a national level, and it's a call for the national government to take what they want to do at their national level. And given the current scenario where almost all the governments, they are not with the people, they are not completely in sync with the concern about climate change. So again, there is still a circumspection whether governments will impose carbon tax. And I am saying, in addition to all this, and those will be my final 2 points. One, I think, since a lot of information was given on Indian, initiatives on climate adaptation and mitigation, I thought, in fact, we need, a national assessment of the current schemes, or whatever incentives or subsidies, and with a lens of mitigation and adaptation, because it becomes easier for us to segregate and see where the funds are going, and what kind of outcomes we can expect from that. Because watershed management, natural resource management, these are projects which are going on for the past 30 years. So right now, if we are going to again repaint them as climate finance, I think we need to see if we are going to reach the goal of adaptation of 50% of the population needs to adapt themselves to the climate crisis or the emergencies by 2030. That's a target given by the recent global goal on adaptation. So in that sense, again, and I'm saying the same projects which have been there, if we say this is going to be part of this adaptation, I think it's only a name change, or it's only label change. So I feel we need to do a national assessment, or a national segregation of these schemes and subsidies as per the mitigation and adaptation. And finally, I think there is a recent information study which says $731 billion have gone in 2021 to fossil fuel subsidies. Now, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is being discussed in COP27. In fact, India is saying don't include just coal. We have to expand the spectrum of fossil fuels so that it is across, the non-proliferation, or ban, or phase down of this fossil fuels. So in that sense, these subsidies, the $731 billion, if that can be stopped, or the subsidies can be stopped, and then that can, lead to reduction or phase down of fossil fuel. And apart from that, if it can be transferred to mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage, it is 7 times more than the $100 billion which is committed there. In fact, there is another assessment which says the Russian profits from fuel price increase arising out of the Russian-Ukraine war is itself 3 times or 4 times the current estimate for climate finance. So there are there are estimates which say, and the people are saying there is money. So this money needs to be channelized. So that means there has to be acceptability, and for that to happen, I think there has to be concerted effort. So leave the international COP27 issues. I feel at the national level, at India, in India, we need to have our own mitigation efforts, which are within our realm of possibility. And for that to happen and for that to get financed, I think we need to again reroute the subsidies and assess each of the subsidies so that it goes to mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Even loss and damage within the country is a big issue, and which we have been raising for the past 30 years with regard to industrial pollution victims, with regard to pharma company victims, and also pesticide poisoning victims. So there are several victims because of this pollution. So I think we need to apply some of these principles at the national level and maybe sub-national level, and see what kind of actions can be recommended both to the government and also to the people, so that we start working on them. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I think, as you mentioned, just to conclude this quickly, it just depends on the intent of the people in power. Just like you said, World Bank chief being a climate denier and things like that. There is money and there are people ready to do the work, but it's not flowing in the right directions because we're getting stuck at not having definitions and clarity and how to disperse this money. Sirs, if you have any more thoughts to share or questions to ask.
No, I don't have. The only question I had was for Sahu on the what NABARD is saying about climate resilient agriculture, because he mentioned that they are giving funds. So what are the components of that climate resilient agriculture?
Actually, sir, when we talk about climate resilient agriculture, not that specific project is termed as climate resilient agriculture, but it
Hello, we lost your voice. Hello. Hello.
Sahu, sir, I think your audio got disconnected.
are you able to hear?
Yes, sir.
Very low, but we are hearing.
Okay, so actually, then other components of like integrating with livestock, then making it a sustainable ways of like having natural farming, more of organic way, more of having like including weather and crop advisory services, then knowledge management part integral, more or less like activity of knowledge sharing plus activities, including certain renewable energy component like solar pumping. So it is like a mix of activities which is more environment friendly, more towards the sustainable practices, and location the way it is required, while addressing the livelihood part. That is the overall. Like we have got near in Uttarakhand area, it's more towards soil moisture, ensuring soil moisture availability in small parcels of land. So it is focused on that way. So associate measures, it is more, it is seen how sustainable it will be and how environment friendly. That is the whole way of doing it.
Thank you, sir. If you have any report, please share.
Definitely,
or anything
definitely
which
will
can give us more information so that we can read.
Sure. I'll screen out projects having orientation towards climate resilient agriculture, and we'll share the document also, sir.
Okay.
Kindly drop your mail ID. Maybe Nikita could help us.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.